completed. President Thomas Jefferson asked Meriwether Lewis to lead a team into this new land for three purposes. First, to explore and to map this new territory. Second, to establish an American presence in this new land. And then third, hopefully to find a northwest passage, an all-water route from the known part of America to the Pacific Ocean. Lewis recruited his good friend, William Clark, and together they developed this team that Thomas Jefferson would later nickname the Corps of Discovery. And after a time of training, Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery began their courageous journey up the Missouri River into this unknown land. They went up the Missouri, across North Dakota and Montana, and finally they found themselves in Idaho, and there's this remarkable moment recorded in the journals where William Clark, a tall man, straddled the little stream that was the headwater of the Missouri River. Believing that the hard work was behind them, they thought that what was before them was just a few days of carrying their canoes over a few hills, and then on the other side of those hills they would see the headwaters of a river that would lead them down to the Pacific Ocean. But on August the 12th, 1805, Lewis's journal records that stunning moment when he topped that last hill. He had seen hills before. He knew about hills. He'd been in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But what he saw before him was not a river heading to the Pacific Ocean. But what he saw was the Rocky Mountains. Mountains unlike anything he had ever seen in his life. Mountains running north to south for more than 3,000 miles and rising towards the sky more than 14,000 feet. These expert river travelers had to figure out how to canoe over mountains. They thought that what was out in front of them was just like what was behind them. And this is the place where the church is in our lifetime. We've got the Rocky Mountains in front of us, and we become good at river travel. But now we have to figure out how to canoe over those mountains. Now, what do I mean? You and I are living in a time in which the obstacles facing the church are monumental, even overwhelming, and are like trying to canoe over mountains. We're living in a time when Sundays are more about soccer and Starbucks than about the Sabbath. We're living in a time when the fastest growing religious affiliation is none whatsoever. 1 in 4 people claiming to have no religious affiliation. And the church in America is in serious decline. All of this at a time when the church seems to want to turn inward on itself, to become inwardly focused. And many church members have begun to see the church as a kind of religious club, primarily there for the benefit of members. And so the question begins to rise, how are we going to change that? How are we going to reach millennials who don't have a good impression of Christians? How are we going to reverse the decline? How are we going to move from a come-to-us mentality to a go-to-them posture? And how will we begin to see ourselves as missionaries and the world around us as our mission field? Like Lewis and Clark, we are facing a mountain of challenges. Well, it's with that in mind that I invite you to consider those first Christians on Pentecost. When you look at them, they are but a small, inauspicious sect within Judaism. From all outward appearances, they weren't much. They've been described as a tiny group of illiterate peasants from a remote, unsavory corner of the Roman Empire. And by best estimates, there were at most a couple of hundred of them, maybe 300. And they had no dream of changing the world. Their expectation was that Jesus would restore Israel to its glory. They were looking back to the days of David and Solomon, and they wanted that to return. That was their dream. When they heard him speak of the kingdom of God, they thought of a place of borders and gates and cities and palaces and victory and glory and power. But Jesus had another thing in mind. Jesus gave them a picture of the kingdom of God that was unlike anything they had ever imagined. A whole new way of living and thinking about kingdom. He says, you guys have got it all wrong. I'm leaving the kingdom in your hands. You'll receive power. You'll be my witnesses. You've seen my life. You've heard what I've taught you. You've seen me die and rise again. I'm going to leave it now to you. But you will receive spiritual power, and you will be my witnesses, first here in Jerusalem, and then in our country in Judea. And then you're going to go over to Samaria, to those people that you don't like and don't like you and believe differently than you do. And then you're going to go to the ends of the earth. I'm turning you loose on the world. Now, these were men and women with no degrees, no money to speak of, no strategic plan. It seems absurd and even laughable, except for one thing. It actually happened. Within 300 years, those first few followers grew to nearly 7 million. How did they have such an impact? It wasn't because they were smarter or more articulate or had more clout or resources. It was because they knew their mission. They took bold risk. And they had the Spirit of the risen Christ within them, empowering them. Now, some of you know that over the last 4 years, I've been working across this country with pastors and churches, and I've seen the importance of these three things again and again. In some places, I've seen tremendous hope and a lot of fruitfulness, but more often than not, as I talk to pastors, as I consult with churches, I'm seeing struggle and despair. Churches stuck in the past without any clear sense of purpose. Churches playing it safe, turned inward on themselves. So with that in mind, I want to lift up three things from the Pentecost experience that we might take away and use. First is this: nothing is sacred but the mission of the church. Nothing is sacred but our mission. And what is that sacred mission? To make disciples of Jesus Christ who will go forth and transform the world. To make new disciples who will use their gifts, their talents, their time, their skills in transforming the world. This is not optional. It's not negotiable. Nothing is more sacred than this mission. The church, as Jesus created it, was meant to be outward focused, not centered in a building. But so often the church turns inward. In fact, it happens so frequently that I've heard it said, if a person is focused in on themselves, we call them selfish. But if the church is focused on itself, we call it normal. Isn't it time that we reclaim a new normal for the church? And one of the first signs of an inward-focused church is when member preferences become more important than our mission. It happens as we begin to see the church as some kind of a religious club, primarily there to serve and benefit the members. Somebody complains about something, we say, oh my, they're complaining. Somebody says, well, I give to the church and I want it to go this way. And we say, oh dear, we've got to listen and Bow to that. Sometimes those are good things, sometimes not so good. But little by little, personal preference gives way, purpose gives way to personal preference. And over again, I've seen it happen. That plateaued and declining churches are driven by preference rather than purpose. So I would encourage you, wherever you are, if this is your church or your church is somewhere else, always to be asking, are we preference-driven or are we purpose-driven? Are we, whatever we do within the mission of making disciples for the transformation of the world, or is it not? And then second, this Pentecost spirit invites us to be willing to make courageous risk. The book of Acts is the story of all kinds of risk and reward, tremendous risk, remarkable rewards. First, Jesus, risking it all on this ragtag group of disciples. And then they took the risk of trusting in His Word and in His Spirit and going forth and living without fear. The young church was characterized by boldness and a willingness to risk. And for a time, the church in America was like that. But little by little, we began to settle for what was safe and comfortable. Over time, we began to feel it's easier to do programs that will make people happy than challenging one another and ourselves to go out into the world and to make disciples and to work on transforming the world. There is this predictable, relentless tendency in all of our institutions and lives to morph away from courageous adventure into a life of tame predictability. But in the world in which we live, with the challenges which we face, with the mountain of opportunity that's out there, we can no longer afford tame predictability. Doing the same thing in the same way and expecting different results is a recipe for decline. So are you taking risks for Christ and the kingdom? You're going to have to try some new things and be sure there are going to be some mistakes along the way and some things aren't going to work, but for the sake of Christ and the kingdom, we have to try. And that leads to the third thing that I would take away from the Pentecost story. Simply this: it's not up to us only. The church of God's dreaming can be experienced through the power of God at work in us. When I was in high school, I got my first car. It was a 56 Chevy with a stick shift on the floor. It was a beautiful baby blue, and I was so proud of that car. I actually got it before my 16th birthday, and they would let me sit in it in the driveway. I polished that car. I cleaned the grease from the engine. If it rained, I would go out and wash it again. I vacuumed the interior. It was a beauty. And sometimes I would turn over the engine and just let it run. And I would back it up in the driveway and move it forward, back it up, move it forward. Sometimes I even drove into the backyard. But I knew I couldn't get away with that very often. Then finally the day came when I got my driver's license. And I went out and I put the key in the ignition and I turned the ignition and nothing happened. My Uncle Bob said, well, maybe it's been sitting up too long. Maybe you need a push. And so we got the car out in the street and he pushed it with his car and I popped the clutch and it just stopped dead. And my Uncle Bob came over and said, Sonny boy, have you put any gas in that thing? And we checked and sure enough, it was out of gas. Now, it gets me to thinking about an internal combustion engine. You know how it works? They need gas. There's a piston inside of a cylinder, and when you turn the starter, it pushes that piston up, and it compresses air and gas, and then the spark plug ignites, and it sets off an explosion, and it moves that piston, and that piston moves the drive shaft. And if it's doing that over and over and over, then it moves forward like it should. It rotates that crankshaft and turns the axle, and you move. But without that drop of gas, that whoosh of air, that brief, bright spark that sets off that explosion, all you have is a beautiful blue hunk of motionless machinery. Now make the leap from my 56 Chevy to the day of Pentecost. The believers were gathered there in that upper room, that room that was about to become a combustion chamber. They'd been waiting there in prayer for power, and nobody heard the intake valve open up. But suddenly there was a sound like a rushing wind, and that combustion chamber filled with just the right mix of God's people and God's Spirit, and the spark went off. And there was an explosion of power, and they went out into the streets to speak to people across the world in ways that they could understand. And they made new disciples, and in time changed the world. Just as engines need gas, so the church needs the Holy Spirit. Without that Spirit, the church is just a hunk of motionless machinery. A friend of mine, Tom Long, says that years ago he was the pastor of a little church, his first church. And he announced on one of his early Sundays there, next Sunday at 10 o'clock, I'm going to start a pastor's Sunday school class to teach the basics of the Christian faith. And so if you're new to the faith and would like a refresher, I'd like for you to come. Join me next Sunday. Well, the next week he was excited and pumped about all the people that were going to fill that room, and he was going to teach them the basics of the faith. But when he got there, he was disappointed because there were only 3 children there. 3 little elementary age girls. He tried to hide his disappointment, and over the next weeks he taught them everything he could about the Christian faith. The week before Pentecost, he said to them, "Do you girls know what Pentecost is?" And they didn't, so he told them the story about how at Pentecost all the church was gathered together in one place, and suddenly there was a rush of a mighty wind, and fire came down, and it filled them with power, and they spoke the gospel to people in languages that they could understand, and 3,000 people were added to the church. Well, 2 of those little girls took that news in stride. But one of those little girls, her eyes as big as saucers, said, "Reverend Long, that's amazing, but I must have been absent that Sunday." The thing about that is not that she misunderstood. But what I want you to hear is the beautiful thing that she actually believed that it could happen. That in that church, God's Spirit could come. That people could catch fire. That they could experience the power of God, that they could go forth and communicate in ways that the world will understand, and in turn transform the world. May it be true in this place for you and for me. Thanks be to God.